Welcome to the T3 Raider Roots podcast. This is T3 Raider Facts, and in our first episode, we visited the bitter and long-standing rivalry between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Oakland Raiders, and an infamous game that ignited the powder keg in Kansas City on a November Sunday in 1970. Today, I'm going to take you even further back, all the way back to 1960 and the creation of a new league, the American Football League. Now, you can't really talk about the AFL without first mentioning the name Lamar Hunt. Almost all his life, Hunt, a Texas oil millionaire, dreamed of bringing a professional football team to Dallas, Texas. But every time he approached the NFL to inquire about getting a team of his own, the answer was always the same: no. So Hunt decided to form a league of his own. He got together a group of guys who, like himself, wanted to get into the business of pro football. One of the members of the group, Wayne Valley, one of the owners of the new Oakland franchise, deemed themselves as the Foolish Club. And so this bold group of owners who love football and just wanted to be part of the action decided to take on Goliath and bring football to some new places. Now, Hunt had already been told by NFL Commissioner Burt Bell that the NFL would not be expanding when Hunt asked about adding a franchise in Dallas. And then he was thwarted in his attempts to buy the Chicago Cardinals and move them to Dallas. They would end up moving to St. Louis. So with the resources to get it off the ground, Hunt set up a league office in Dallas and brought on interested parties to set up teams in Houston, Denver, Minneapolis, and Seattle, in addition to his own Dallas team. He also knew that he needed to bring both New York and Los Angeles into the mix as well. So when Hunt announced the start of the new league, the NFL suddenly reversed its position and decided to start a team in Dallas in order to sink Mr. Hunt and his new vision. Lamar was already looking at making the league an 8-team league and was looking for new places to land. Buffalo and Boston were added, and Seattle was dropped because it had no place to play. Now, right before the NFL draft, there had been rumors that the Minneapolis group was going to pull out and join the NFL. But the leader of the ownership group denied this in a telephone call the night right before the draft. The very next day, Minneapolis defected to the NFL. It was all part of an orchestrated plan to sabotage the new league, to cast the impression to new college players that the new league was already falling apart and that players would be much better off signing with the already established NFL. Now, when Minneapolis pulled out, Baron Hilton, the owner of the Los Angeles group, went to Hunt and said that he needed another California team to create a rivalry with his own team, the Chargers. He was looking specifically at the Bay Area, but with the 49ers already entrenched in San Francisco, the problem was solved after a quick meeting with representatives of a group just across the bay in Oakland. Hilton was the driving force behind the creation of a team in Oakland. From there, as the league started to grow, the three teams that boasted owners with the deepest pockets and the best chance for the league to survive were Los Angeles, led by Hilton, the Houston franchise under Texas millionaire Bud Adams, and of course Hunt in Dallas. With their resources, they were able to get some of the best college talent and outbid NFL teams to obtain star quality players. Among the most prominent signings was Houston's acquisition of All-America running back Billy Cannon from Louisiana State University, a collegiate legend. It's not surprising that these three teams fared well during the early years of the league. Houston's Oilers won the first two league championships in 1960 and 1961. Hunt's Dallas Texans won in 1962 before moving to Kansas City. And the Chargers, who had moved to San Diego, were champions in 1963. Hilton and Hunt both knew that it would take time to be in a position to turn a profit. But these men were in it for the love of the game, not just a turn of the dollar. However, the teams in New York, Denver, and Oakland were really struggling. The Denver team was on the verge of folding. The New York team, which started out as the Titans, were badly mismanaged. And the Raiders in Oakland were having front office infighting among their several owners, even as they were also fighting to gain an identity in Oakland. The Raiders were definitely having financial problems. After a couple of seasons with very poor attendance, some of the guys panicked and bailed out. Oakland was definitely operating on a shoestring budget, and the Raiders' public relations office even had trouble giving away free tickets to games. In Oakland, the stadium was not a stadium, said Texans and later Chiefs quarterback Lynn Dawson. It was Ewell Field along an expressway, and they had bleacher seats like a high school, and the locker room was like a Quonset hut thing, slapdash together. To get to that field, you had to walk through the crowd. Not that there were too many faces back then. Normally, players walking into a locker room would expect to see lockers, but not at Frank Ewell Field. Instead, Players had to hang their clothes on pegs scattered along the wall. There were no lockers. In fact, the locker room itself was so small that the coaches would have to hold their meetings in the end zone. There were lots of struggles and growing pains for the new league. As finances became an increasing concern, the ownership group in Oakland got a boost as one of the fellow owners, Ralph Wilson of Buffalo, loaned them $400,000 to make ends meet. Attendance continued to wane, and in 1962, the Raiders finished as the worst team in the league at 1-13. They needed a boost. They needed some help. So they decided to turn their attention to a bright young football mind who'd been serving as the receivers coach down in San Diego after having worked as an assistant coach at the University of Southern California. That man's name was Al Davis. Now, Al Davis studied under the offensive genius of football giant Sid Gilman. Gilman believed that the guys who threw and caught the ball would be the backbone of the growing league and be the catalyst for its growing popularity. Gilman is famed for saying, "The big play comes with the pass. God bless those runners because they get the first down, give you the ball control, and keep your defense off the field. But if you want to ring the cash register, you have to pass." Gilman had been an immediate success when he came over to the AFL from the college ranks, having been both at Miami of Ohio and the University of Cincinnati. Baron Hilton brought him in as the coach for his Los Angeles Chargers, who soon moved to San Diego. Bill Walsh, who was always considered the inventor of the West Coast offense, had said that Gilman was so far ahead of his time that people couldn't totally understand what he was doing. Gilman was one of the great offensive minds in football history, and he was an immediate success with the Chargers, who made it all the way to the title game against Houston in year one of the AFL. Gilman would go on to lead the Chargers to the 1963 league crown and 5 more division championships. Gilman passed on his philosophies on the development of the passing game and offensive-minded football to his protege, Al Davis. Al said he was way ahead of his time in organization, in the passing game, and offensive football. Speaking of Sid Gilman. In the 60s, the passing game was not yet really developed, but Sid Gilman was the father of modern-day passing. It had been thought of as vertical, the length of the field, but Sid also thought of it as horizontal. Sid used the width of the field. Several of Gilman's mannerisms and habits rubbed off on Al Davis. For one thing, Sid was an outstanding coach who really had a great recruiting style. He brought in quality players and coaches. He'd always had a great eye for talent. Legend has it that Gilman, while working as a movie theater usher, would take home football segments of the newsreels and watch them on his own projector, which he bought for $15. Sid lived and breathed football, and he would watch film for hours and run it backward and forward late into the night, watching every play and determining which players he wanted to keep and which players couldn't make the club. He would also look at his opponents and determine their tendencies, their strengths, and their weaknesses. Gilman once said, "I hate like hell to have something happen on a football field that I'm not familiar with or that I haven't seen. Anytime I see a good idea, it goes on a sheet. I collect ideas." And he went on to say, football has evolved into a game of looks. It's not the number of plays, but taking one play and running it from 8, 9, 10 different formations in both the passing game and the running game. In the old days, coaches would pride themselves on the number of plays they'd run. You would hear about a coach that has 500 plays. That's gone, dead and buried. We'd take a dozen plays and run 24 formations. That helped us by cutting down practice times and not having to work on so many different thoughts. No matter how smart or how great a player or team is, you don't want to load them down with too much. So when the Raider organization brought on the 32-year-old coaching talent to try and transform a floundering team, not much was expected of Al Davis early on. But they didn't know him very well. They didn't know his passion for football, his tenacity, his commitment to excellence. So when he turned a 1-13 team into a 10-4 team in just 1 year, with 2 of those wins coming against his old San Diego team and his old mentor, the league began to sit up and take notice of Al Davis, as did the rest of the football world. Al had always wanted to lead a sports team. As a kid growing up in Brooklyn, he was impressed by the dominance of the New York Yankees in baseball, and he was awed by the marching cadets of West Point and their football teams that won national championships in the 1940s, gleaming in their black and silver uniforms. So how exactly did a kid from Brooklyn make it to the West Coast and change a team, the fortunes of a region, and the landscape of professional football? Well, in order to answer those questions, you have to trace Al Davis's path. And what you will see is that although Al didn't create the American Football League, He did at one point heft it onto his shoulders and define himself and his team, which would eventually become interchangeable in name and in theory: Al Davis and the Oakland Raiders. When Al was just 5 years old, his family moved to the Crown Heights district of Brooklyn across the Lincoln Terrace Park. It was there that Al would fill his days playing baseball, football, and basketball with the neighborhood kids. Brooklyn at that time was a diverse place for children growing up and mingling in multi-ethnic groups. Sports was the assimilating factor, but the park itself was one tough melting pot. Davis remembered the time. "I still remember all the kids who played there," he said, "and how we gravitated to school teams and sports. We didn't have the training, teaching, and the weather that I became familiar with as an adult in California. It was a whole different environment. As early as grade school at PS 189, I was already mingling with superior athletes, kids like Bug Shackman, Herbie Lance. At Winthrop Junior High School, which will be called a middle school later today, students had to march to class and wore uniforms that featured a white collared shirt and a red tie. You took tests to see which high school you could attend. And because I wanted to play basketball, which was probably my best sport at the time, I qualified to go to Erasmus Hall to play for the great Al Badane, a legendary coach at schoolboy basketball." Davis played all the major team sports as a high school kid, but he really wanted to be a basketball player. Unfortunately, he never got much beyond the bench level. Davis was average size, just under 6 feet, with skinny legs and no natural quickness. However, he had other qualities that would more than make up for this. He was a wide-eyed, sociable teenager, once voted most popular in his class. "Football began to interest me greatly by the time I was in my late teens," Davis admitted, "with strategic and psychological aspects of the sport getting a grip on me. I got into them enough to manage an athletic scholarship when I went off to college at the age of 17 to a little Lutheran school in Ohio named Wittenberg. But after one semester, Davis transferred to Syracuse University because he wanted to be around sports competition at a higher level. At the time, Syracuse football was emerging as a college football powerhouse, led by Floyd Schwartzwalder, a former Army officer who participated in the D-Day invasion on the Normandy beaches in 1944. Perhaps it was Davis's admiration of the great teams at West Point from his youth, combined with the tough military perspective of Coach Schwartzwalder, that helped to mold and shape Al Davis's militaristic approach to the game. The coach also helped shape Davis's social philosophy. Coach Ben, as he was called, helped develop his first major football star, a young man named Bernie Custis, one of the early black quarterbacks in the college game. Custis was drafted by the Cleveland Browns in 1951, but they tried to convert him to safety. Custis made the decision to move north, where he became the first black quarterback in modern professional football for the Hamilton Tiger Cats of the Canadian Football League. Custis's roommate at Syracuse was none other than Al Davis. From that point on, and for the rest of his life, Al became a strong advocate and activist for equal opportunity and social change. Although he majored in English, all Al really wanted to do was coach. So upon graduating from Syracuse, he returned home briefly to Brooklyn, then headed out to Long Island to tiny Adelphi College, where he'd heard there was an opening in the press by gumption that he immediately sent word back to the athletic office to make room for a budding new coach. And so it was at Adelphi College that Al Davis got his coaching start at the age of 21. Now that he was actually on a football field with young men who were virtually his age, that awoke something in the young coach. "I now saw the game as a whole," he said, "made up of challenging tactical parts. I was fascinated with the strategy of football. I felt I understood what ought to work with given personnel in any situation." But this was just the first of several stops for Davis. Now that he was a coach, Al Davis began to attend lectures and truly became a student of the game and of coaching strategies. Scholastic magazine had a side publication called Scholastic Coach that was edited by Herman Mason. The publication contained technical football articles. In April of 1952, Mason accepted a piece titled Offensive Line Quarterbacking. Its author was Al Davis. In it, he proposed a revolutionary idea of the center and tackles calling out blocking assignments at the line of scrimmage, a practice now common in pro football. Mason had made the comment that 95% of the coaches I have to rewrite, but not Al's. He was brilliant. It was like osmosis. Everything he ever heard just seeped in. Davis ended up sending a copy of his article to Sid Gilman, who was then coaching at the University of Cincinnati. Gilman replied with a letter that read, "Your article presents one of the finest call systems for blocking I have ever heard about. I believe it was splendidly written, and I do feel certain that you were destined for great things in this coaching business." And so the paths of Al Davis and Sid Gilman first crossed. Even as Al would take on his first professional coaching assignment with the Raiders after leaving Gilman's staff, Sid Gilman knew that Al Davis was going to be successful. In our next episode, we'll see how a young coach from a small school in Long Island will start to make his imprint and how it will take him south and west. There are three sources I would like to credit for information leading to the creation of this episode. I'd like to give proper credit to Murray Olderman, author of Just Win, Baby, the Al Davis Story. To Bruce Kebrick, John Kingdon, and Steve Corcoran, co-authors of Behind the Raiders' Shield. To Ken Rappaport, the author of The Little League That Could, and also to NFL Films. Join me next time as I delve deeper into the rise to the coaching ranks of one Al Davis, how it brought him to Oakland, and how he began to grow the legend and the mystique of the Raiders. Until then, as I always say, passion always outlives fashion. This is T3 wishing you a bright silver moon shining in the dark black night.